Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Crime and Entertainment. Now, I have here a very special guest. I discovered his podcast long before I ever started doing one of my own. I guess you could say I'm a wiretapper myself. He has a great show that you guys need to check out. If you enjoy this channel, I know good and well you'll love his. It's called Gangland Wire. Please welcome to the show, Gary Jenkins. Gary, how are you, my friend?
I'm great, Wade. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, look here. I'm glad you could stop by. Now, as I was saying, I discovered your podcast a long time ago, and I'm always on the lookout for good mob content. And man, you have a lot on there, and good mob content. You got great interviews. I tell you, one of the best ones I heard on your show out of anybody, and that's including my own, was that one you done with Mikey Scars.
Yeah. People love it. They really like that. Although I'll tell you what, Wade, and you've got an accent a little bit like mine, maybe just a little bit further south from me.
Yeah.
And some of those New York guys, they blasted me for my hillbilly accent in the comments on YouTube. I mean, they blasted me. You got to have a thick skin when you're doing this kind of work.
Yeah, you can't let things bother you, man. If I spent all day worried about them YouTube comments, I wouldn't be able to keep doing interviews.
Really. But yeah, he was an interesting guy, and that was just a fluke. I kind of did him a favor in a way. I mean, I was trying to protect him. I know a guy that knows him.
Mm-hmm.
And
I know a guy.
I know a guy. So I got hold of that guy, and he said, well, we really probably wouldn't do it. And this guy had written an article about him. So I just took this guy's article and rewrote it and made myself a script and then just discussed Mikey Scars. So then somebody makes a comment like a year later, even, I think it was months later, on my website. I put up my show notes, and you can make comments on my website. Most podcasts are like this. And somebody made a comment, and they acted like they knew him, and they talked about some piece of furniture that they had. And I thought, well, that's interesting. So I get hold of my friend. He's got Cosa Nostra News. Ed Scarpa is what he writes under. And I emailed him, and I said, just tell him, I know you can contact him. Just tell him I got this message. It may not mean anything. And so about a week later, I get a message. I get an email, and it's him. And he's kind of like questioned me about this. So I emailed back. I said, it's like somebody's trying to look for him. And so I emailed back. I said, I don't know, dude. I just got this as a comment on my website, and I just wanted you to know that these people were acting familiar and kind of acting like they're reaching. This guy was kind of reaching out for you. So I just thought you ought to know. That's all I know. So he got right back, and he said, "Oh yeah." I said, "I got you." And I said, "You're law enforcement, so I wasn't real too worried about it." And then so I just emailed right back. I said, "Hey, you want to do an interview?" And he emailed right back. He said, "Well, sure." So we did.
It's funny how that stuff works out like that, isn't it?
So I had the first interview with Mikey Scars since right after he went into witness protection. Some guy did one. It was like some kind of I don't remember if it was National Geographic or a news channel or something. So he had been, nobody talked to him in several years. And so I got the first one. We talked quite a while. It was a long interview and covered a lot of things.
That was really good.
Wade, when he started describing the night that he got made, the making ceremony, and who he was made with, he was made with John Gotti Jr. and Sammy the Bull had to conduct the ceremony because John Gotti Senior said he shouldn't do it because it looked like nepotism, or he probably didn't use that word, but it would look bad. And I was agog. I mean, my jaw probably dropped open if he could have seen me as he's describing all that. I thought, man, I got some gold here. This is dynamite.
Yeah, when you're into this kind of stuff and you're well versed on, what it means to be made and how sacred that ceremony is, I mean, that's a huge deal. Yeah. And especially, Sammy the Bull being there, John Gotti Jr. I mean, that's a big deal. And I've much like you, I've been able to talk with both sides of the fence on this. I've talked with a lot of mob guys, some that's been made, some that were just, soldiers and associates. But on the flip side, we've also got to talk to a lot of law enforcement. We've talked with Giovanni Rocco, that went undercover in the DeKalb County up there in New Jersey. We've had Jay Dobbins on the show. We've had Lou Velozzi, Ignacio Esteban, who you and I spoke of earlier. So we've interviewed a lot of the same people. Is it interesting how you can kind of get both takes? Because I believe there's a mutual respect across the board, and we'll get into that here with your past here in just a second. But I think there's a mutual respect between the gangster and the law enforcement because they're both doing a job. The gangster's trying to do what they do to make a living, and then the law enforcement's doing what they do to make a living. That just happens to be their job is to stop the gangster.
Right.
How do you feel about? You think there's a mutual respect there?
There's a it's a kind of a deal that there's rules, and
Right.
the mafia as an organization has rules, and they know better than to they start messing with the rules. It's hard on them. It's really hard on them, and so and I think the mutual respect comes in that they don't mind matching wits with somebody that's halfway intelligent and is really focused on them, has a lot of has some skills, has some equipment, put some money and energy into it, and so they can kind of match wits with somebody, and if they get by with it, they win. If they don't, they lose. And it's just a game. As the Godfather said, it's just business. It's not personal.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the underlying factor of the mob. Now, I've got a good friend here in Kansas City. Actually was supervised the surveillance team that ended up putting him away. Now he would be more like a mob associate, if loosely described as an associate. He knows everybody. He knows all of them, and he had his own thing going, and we were following him all over the place, and they had an informant in on him, and he was selling. They had a Dilaudid. That's a narcotic.
Yeah.
They don't even have that anymore. I don't think it's kind of a synthetic heroin before OxyContin used to be Dilaudid.
Mm-hmm.
Anyhow, he had a Dilaudid ring going, and so we're talking not too long ago, and he looked at me and said, "You know what I like about talking with you?" He said, "Is you and we talk the same language." He said, "When I mention something, a situation or people, you know what I'm talking about. Most civilians, if you will, they don't know what you're talking about."
Yeah.
So that's part of the rapport that we have personally, and I think it's like the mob and the guys that focus on the mob that work the intelligence unit or the organized crime squads or whatever they call them. You talk the same language, and you know the same things, and you have something in common. So that's my 2 cents worth on that one.
Yeah. I think probably one of the greatest scenes in the motion pictures that depicts that whole relationship is that scene in the movie Heat when Al Pacino and Robert De Niro, and a spoiler, they're not actually sitting together. They had to shoot that separately because I actually had Tom Sizemore on the show who was in there with them. He was part of the bank robbing crew.
Yeah.
And if you notice in the TV show, in the movie, they're never in the shot at the same time. It's always an over the shoulder of the other one. So they actually shot that separately, which to me is more impressive because of how they still stayed in character and the way they're bantered back and forth. And it's just like, Robert De Niro was who he was. He took scores, and, Al Pacino was who he was, and he was going to stop guys like him. So I thought that was very telling, and I think that's probably how, by and large, most people look at it. But, you've got a history in law enforcement. Kind of tell our viewers who may not know exactly who you are, what your role was in law enforcement and kind of what got you in. Obviously, we'll go into some of your dealings with the Kansas City, but then what kind of got you into doing this here?
Well, that's a lot, dude.
Well, we'll skim down a version.
We're starting back in 1971. We start back in 1971 when I was bored working on an assembly line at the Ford Motor Company. You ever work on an automotive assembly line?
Not automotive, but I've been on the assembly line.
That's some hard work, dude. That is hard work and boring and dull, and to go to the bathroom, you have to wait till somebody comes and lets you go, Yeah. But so they were hired on the Kansas City Police Department, and I said, I'm going to try that. I tried it, and got on pretty quick. Didn't have too checkered of a history. Kind of a funny little story about that. They give you a lie detector test, and they ask you a question: did you ever commit a felony with a gun? And I said, well, no. But as I said no, my mind this scene pops in my mind when I'm about 17 years old, and me and my buddy Eddie are out drunk, and we grew up in the country, and you got guns. You always
Oh yeah.
got guns. So we got guns, and we'd been out shooting or something the day before or during that afternoon, and so we said, well, let's go shoot up some mailboxes. So we shot up. I bet we shot up 20 mailboxes that night. I mean, it was a stupid juvenile act of vandalism, but that's what teenage boys do, is they vandalize things. And that whole scene popped in my head as I said no. and then my mind goes, well, was that a felony? I don't know. I don't know. Was that a felony? And that guy never even tripped. He just kept on going, and nobody ever said anything about that. So, so much for lie detectors, huh?
Yeah.
But I get on the police department. Fast forward, you got to do your 2 years, 3 years in patrol. I did a couple of years as a station detective, which working residence burglaries, and seems kind of boring. But every once in a while, you get a burglary crew working, a bunch of guys, usually kids, but sometimes men, drug addicts, and they'd be like we had guys that were hitting this one high-rise apartment building, and we ended up catching one of them in the act, and so we did some things like that. And then I got a chance to go to the intelligence unit. My good friend from time we were about 5 years old on had made a connection. I mean, to get in the intelligence unit, you got to have a variety of things going for you. You got to be pretty well known and with some police skills. You have to be easily vetted. You have to have people that know you, maybe know your family or know something about you and your history before they're going to take you in. And so Bobby had gotten in, and he knew a guy that already worked down there and been there quite a while. And that guy's wife worked with Bobby's wife at a jewelry for a jewelry store company in the offices. And then they needed somebody, and Bobby was at loose ends where he was working, and they brought him in. And then he'd been down there about a year, and an opening came up, and I'd already been making some political moves down there to try to get down there. They knew I wanted to come, and I had Bobby down there, and he'd known me since I was about 5 years old. So, I was in, and we became partners, and we started working the mob, and it was fun. We used to say we can't believe they'd pay us to do this. We ought to be paying them to have this much fun every day, doing little surveillances and in the intelligence unit and the mob. You don't have a report that comes in and say, okay, go solve this crime. Mm-hmm. You just go out and try to develop informants and sources, or drive around and see where they were sitting, where their cars were, and write down their license numbers, and maybe follow them a little bit, see where else they went, see what businesses they might frequent, what bars they might go to, and who they met, and just document that stuff and put it in a file, and mainly send that off to the FBI, who had the organized crime squad. Because we didn't really have the tools, the legal tools in Jackson County, Kansas City, Missouri, to deal with the mob. We didn't have wiretap, witness protection. We didn't have a budget. Hell, when I first came to the intelligence unit, we had, I think, 4 cars, 12 guys, 4 cars, 5 cars. 1 was the captain's, 2 were the sergeants, and then we had 2 cars to share between about 10 guys usually working the day shift, or 8 guys working the day shift. But we could borrow the captain's or the sergeant's cars unless they had to run errands or had to go somewhere that day. So we didn't have a lot of, but we even used our own cars a little bit. And so anyhow, we had a great time. It was, you eat what you kill. You can be as successful as you want to be. You're only bounded by your imagination and the law, in working on these things and finding informants and finding little schemes and scams that are going on. Like, you found a place that started watching, because the mob guys were going there. It was like a business we'd never heard of before. We started watching it and seeing these trucks come and going. It was an insulation business. They were insulating houses, and then we found the guy that ran it, a guy named Bob Ferrara, and he was a noted scammer. His whole life, that's all he'd ever done was scam people. And they had a boiler room going inside, and they were, high power selling this insulation, and the insulation was supposed to be really good and fireproof and all that, and it was nothing. It was really crappy insulation. They did crappy jobs, and he ran that for about 6 months, and just till the complaints built up like he couldn't believe, and then he just disappears. And during that time, like every mob guy in town dropped by there at one time or another and talked to him. Found out later from my friend that I mentioned earlier that Bob Ferrara was always in hock with loan sharks. The big gambler, and he was always hurting for money, or he needed money to go into another scheme. And sometimes he'd make money and sometimes he didn't, but he was always in hock to loan sharks.
Okay.
So, we do things like that. And then we ended up being part of a really big operation that became the one called the Straw Man. We were part of mainly the surveillance crews on the Straw Man. And Straw Man was a code name the FBI gave to the investigation into skimming from Las Vegas casinos.
Okay, that's what I was going to talk about.
Really started the story behind the movie and the book Casino started right here in Kansas City.
And see, that's something I think gets glossed over, because when you think of the mob or whatever, I know some people, most people think about New York and then obviously Chicago, but Kansas City is just one of them areas that gets glossed over. That and Detroit, I think, don't get the due that they probably deserve, because there was some heavyweights out there. And like you said, that kind of pretty much started there in Kansas City with the Kansas City Skim. How did you guys get involved in that, and how long did it take to kind of figure out what was going on?
Well, we had a mob war going between some Young Turks brothers. Matter of fact, one of my documentaries I've done is called Brothers Against Brothers, the Sevilla Spiro War. Mm-hmm. And so these brothers, Joe, Mike, Carl, and Nick, and the Sevilla operation has two brothers, Carl and Nick Sevilla, who's the boss. And his brother was kind of as hot-headed. They called him Cork because he'd blow his cork. Hot-headed guy. And they had facilitated, shall we say, the murder of the oldest Spiro brother. And the other three spent the next several years trying to get revenge. And the Sevilla faction, they were frantically trying to stay alive and avoid one of the Spiros killing them, and tried to kill the Spiros off, and which they did over a period of time. Ended up killing all four brothers by the time it was over.
Wow.
And so this mob war is going on, and the Bureau has a really good informant, a guy named Mike Ruffalo, who ended up going in witness protection and has died since. Mike Ruffalo tells them that he and his fall partner, a guy named Gene Shepard, had met with Carl Sevilla, or Cork Sevilla, at a little tavern, as a pizza place called the Villa Capri, kind of over just outside, right next to Little Italy, is an area called Northeast. And Little Italy is kind of the really old section of it. And then as people kind of moved out away from the original Little Italy from the turn of the century, a lot of Italian people, a lot of Italian businesses, and in this area where the Villa Capri is. And they met, Mike Ruffalo and Gene Shepard would meet Cork at this same table every time, and there would be talk about maybe how we're going to get these Spiros. They hired him they gave him money. They gave these two guys money to go plant a stick of dynamite on a strip club owner's car just to intimidate him and scare him so they could extort money from him and move in on his strip club operation. So there's dirty talk going on at these tables. So you got to build your probable cause. You need to get a microphone back there. Mm-hmm. Not thinking of nothing about skimming. Everybody kind of knew they were probably skimming. They knew they had a lot of connections to the Teamsters. They knew they were always trying to get money out of Vegas casinos, but nobody was really onto the scheme, getting close to how you would uncover this. And so they want to hear this dirty talk about murders in Kansas City, because they know they're scheming on the Spiro brothers. They're scheming on another guy named Freddie Bonadonna. That they may be scheming on somebody else. And they've got a good informant that says they're having this, what we call dirty talk, back at this same table. Well, you go in, you look, and all our old surveillance reports, you show that you find that these mob guys, the underboss Tuffy DeLuna, the kind of the co-boss or the brother of the boss, Carl Sevilla, and a guy named Charlie Mortina, was a really high up trusted guy. and Joe Ragusa, Vince Abbott, all these main guys would be there all the time. And we'd written those license numbers down 100 times. We'd gone in there and sat and had a drink and ate some pizza maybe, or had 2 or 3 beers, and they'd always be in there at some point in the evening sitting at the same table. They'd always at the same table. So there's your probable cause that, yeah, these guys do sit back there. Your informant says, yeah, they have dirty conversation, and there's these other things going on that you can throw in about the Spiro Sabella War and the plot to get Freddie Bonadonna and kill him. And so they put microphones. They go in that place one night and they put a couple of microphones back by that table. And so they're talking, they're listening to it. And as Bill Owsley, one of the agents that he was the case agent for the straw man case, he said, I thought I could listen to Staying Alive no more after that's all I was hearing was Staying Alive off the jukebox, because they loved that song. But finally one night they're talking and you hear little tidbits of $25 million. Are we in on that with them? Well, what about Lefty? Well, when you were out at the Stardust and you saw Jay Brown, and well, Genius, somebody's going to have to talk to Genius. Oh, well, I talked to him and I told him, you got to make a public announcement or do whatever the fuck you got to do, boy, and get out of that. So they know. Then this is all in a conversation about Las Vegas. Mm-hmm. And so you got Teamsters, millions of dollars, and Lefty, who they figured out real quick was Lefty Rosenthal,
right?
And Stardust. They mentioned the Stardust, and Lefty's working at the Stardust, so it's easy to put this together, what they're talking about. And then one of the last things that Tuffy said was, well, I got to go get a phone because I needed to talk to somebody in Las Vegas. I got to go get a phone. Well, there's a phone right there. There's a pay phone right there. Well, that lets you know that, hey, he's got a phone out there that is cool. And so we doing this. That's when we came into it to help with surveillance, because they must have put together a surveillance team of 50 guys there for first week or so. And 2 airplanes, one at the ready as the other one ran out of gas. The other one was ready to go. Constant aerial surveillance, aerial coverage, and 24-hour day coverage on Tuffy DeLuna, who said, I got to get to a phone, because he's the one that was talking about how he needed to talk to his man in Vegas. And it's hard, doing something like, he's really surveillance conscious. You just start out with, you catch him, maybe he's leaving. Most people have a little bit of a pattern. So he leaves about the same time late in the morning because he's out late at night. He'll leave late in the morning, and maybe he just got the plane up watching the street there in front of his house, and he sees his car going down the street about the time that he normally would leave. So he radio on the ground, and they pick him up 4 or 5 blocks down the road. That guy will take him for just, maybe a block, or if even that, another car will cut in. Maybe somebody will be in front of him and parallel him a block over. And it took about a week. And finally, they caught him at a hotel. It's torn down now. Can't even remember the name of it now, but a hotel over in the East Bottoms in a trucking area, really, but it was right off of an interstate, I-435. And caught him going down in there and then coming back out. So then you get somebody, next time you see him get anywhere close, you get somebody down there and get them inside the hotel in the lobby already. And he's close, and hopefully he comes down, which he did, goes down. Then you see him get on, there's a bank of 3 payphones. You see him get on a payphone. So then you go pull the numbers off those payphones to see, what kind of long distance activity's been there. And you've got, probably, I don't think they captured local information, but they did capture long distance information. You find calls back and forth to Las Vegas. Bam, you got him. Now you gotta get wires on those phones. So they tried to they got in there once, and this is a pretty good story here. We weren't part of this. I don't know. They had us off doing something else, probably going back watching the Spiros, make sure they didn't go kill one of the Spiros or one of the Sabellas or Tuffy or somebody, because that's mainly what we did, was try to keep those guys from killing each other and maybe catch them in the process of doing a hit, but yet you didn't know quite when to take the action to stop them or let them go. It was dicey. It went on for over a year. So the Bureau they got two or three, no lady agents at that time, but they got a couple, three female clerks down there and several agents. And they knew that they had some information that Tuffy was going to be going to the phone that day. And they set up, like it was warm, they set up like a pool party. They had beer and they had people going in and out and laughing and talking. And to go back and forth by the pool, you had to pass right by this bank of three payphones. So then one of them, Kopovica, he got on the payphone as Tuffy got real close. So he's talking and talking and talking, and Tuffy just stands back and waits for him. So finally he gets off the phone. Well, then also know that he has to have the guys calling that number. Yeah. He's not calling out for that one. Somebody's calling that number. Just little tidbits. Just keep picking up and picking up. Then he finally got on the phone. Then they'd walk by and they'd pick up little snippets of conversation, and then try to put that and that was all to really finalize an affidavit for a wiretap on that phone, on a public phone. And after that, all you had to do was get Tuffy close down and going in to that hotel, and then they could start listening. And so they just kind of scanned back and forth on those phones. They had all three of them wired and just scanned back and forth until they know Tuffy's inside the hotel, until they hear his voice, and then they lock in on that one and listen for a little bit.
Right.
And so that's the rest is history. So that was kind of interesting.
Who was the genius that they talked about?
The genius was Alan Glick. He was a guy that, he was the one that approached. Actually, he approached Frank Ballesteri in Milwaukee as the Milwaukee boss.
Yeah.
And there's a guy you might want to have on is Gavin Smith, if you want to talk about Milwaukee mob. He's real educated on that and written some books.
Absolutely.
Milwaukee boss, somehow Glick got a connection to Frank Ballesteri. Some people say he went to law school with his son. Other people say no, he didn't. I read another thing that seemed a little more accurate, that somebody in Las Vegas that worked at the casino had introduced him to a low-level teamster from Chicago, who then somehow got him to Frank Ballesteri. Anyhow, he gets to Frank Ballesteri, and Frank says, maybe we can work something out, because he tells him what he wants is a teamster loan. Mm-hmm. He's been told that you get a teamster loan to then buy up the four casinos that he wanted to buy up: the Stardust, the Aladdin, the Hacienda, and the Marina. Mm-hmm. He wanted to buy those four casinos, formed this corporation called Argent. And he really didn't have any wherewithal. He had maybe $1 million in assets at the time. He's 32 years old, had really developed after he got back from Vietnam. He had gotten real estate business, and best he'd done is develop a small strip mall somewhere. And he got a little Teamsters loan on that. And that was another way he got in with the Teamsters too. But Ballesteri then gets his man on the Teamsters, but see, he can't, this is too big a loan for Ballesteri.
Right.
He can't just get him to loan $62 million. So he contacts, of course, IUPA down in Chicago, and John Scalise, if he was still alive, the Cleveland mob boss. Ended up Milton Rockman was a guy called Massey Rockman, was a Jewish guy, but he really handled all the money down there in Cleveland. And and Kansas City, Nick Savella, and all these guys, the other three cities, they had their own people who had influence over the pension fund. Mm-hmm. And to get the pension fund board to approve this kind of a loan. Frank Ballesteri had a guy who was a member of the board, a Teamster named Frank Rainey. We had a Teamster named Roy Lee Williams, who will end up being the international president for a short period of time. And they had a guy in Cleveland named, I just lost his name. He's actually a top echelon informant for the Bureau at this point in time. I'll think of it a little bit. Yeah, they've got a guy on the board, and Chicago has Alan Dorfman, who right. really has invested money for the board and really has a lot of influence on the board. So they then influence this loan, and then Glick goes back and he knows that what he's got to do. And he's told, you've got a guy already working out there, Lefty Rosenthal, who will take care of you, taking care of us. You got to mm-hmm. kick back to us. And he knows that. So he just turns a blind eye to all that. And Lefty, who's already worked at the casino, what he does is he it's a Robert De Niro character for you guys that
Right.
don't know. Um, he gets promoted pretty quickly into positions where he can then put his skim operation into position to then pull the money out.
So is Glick's character the guy? I think they called him Stony in the movie where they're sitting there by the pool, and he's telling him, you don't have to put, you can put it your, title as food and beverage manager, and then they'll take your application and put it at the bottom of the pile. Is that the character that he's portraying, or that's based on him rather?
Oh God, I can't remember. Glick.
Did he get shot? I know at the end of the movie they shoot him.
Not Glick.
Okay.
That was Dorfman.
Okay, this is in the movie they show with Frank Collada, I think, was actually playing the hitman in the movie. They shot him out in like the parking lot.
That's Dorfman. That's Alan Dorfman.
Okay, that's Alan Dorfman. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
It's a whole other story how he ended up getting shot. So it's kind of get
yeah, you can get lost in this
movie mixed up, and there's
you can get lost in that trial. I'll tell you, interesting guest that I had on the show was Oscar Goodman.
You had Oscar Goodman?
Wow. Yeah.
I made a run on him. I sent some guy told me he was going to make a run on him for me, but I never heard back.
Yeah, I got a friend of mine that I interviewed, knowed him real well, so she pulled a favor. She's like, you're into this mob stuff. She said, if you want to interview a guy named Oscar Goodman, I was like, yes, I want to.
Yeah, I don't think anybody else ever interviewed him on podcast.
Yeah, the only person that I seen that did it was, at least on video, was Patrick Bet-David, Valuetainment.
Yeah.
So I was really excited for that, man. And I mean,
that was a coup there.
Yeah, he basically represented all those top guys, and even guys, back in Boston, Vinny Ferrara. I mean, a lot of those guys.
Yeah.
So he definitely made his rounds. But I mean, he said when they hired him, he actually played the lawyer on Casino.
Yeah.
He said he's pretty openly that he likes his Bombay Sapphire jalapenos. And he said, I come through there to come to the showing. And he said they had Joe Pesci so on the mark. He said, Tony used to hold his briefcase like a little crook in his arm. And he said, I come through there for the scene. And he said, I thought, my God, I know I'm sober, but that looks like him. It looks like he's come back from the dead. Yeah, that was good. Yeah, he had me cracking up. But I mean, that's a whole nother story, like you said, where you can go a lot of different ways with that because, getting the Teamsters, money to build the casinos. And then obviously you have the fallout with Lefty and Tony, and then Tony and them getting killed, him and his brother. That's a whole nother story that can lead back to Chicago. So it's very interesting how you can start out with one little thing and then it leads to 3 or 4 different states, a couple different families. And like what you were mentioning with the Savella Wars up there, that kind of resembles to me that war that went on for years and years down there in Philadelphia. Because it seemed like to me, once Bruno got taken out, there didn't nobody hold that job for quite a while. It just seemed to be war after war after war. And that's quite an interesting story they got down there in Philly too.
Yeah, that is. It's kind of like, I tell you, it's even more like the one in Cleveland with Danny Green, the Kill the Irishman story.
Yeah, I would love to get some. Have you interviewed anybody that like wrote a book on him or something?
Yeah, get Rick Perello.
Rick Perello?
Perello.
That needs to, I want to do that.
Afterwards, I'll send you his contact information.
Yeah, he's got a crazy story, man. If anybody, you mentioned it earlier, but if anybody hasn't seen the movie Kill the Irishman, it's a real good movie.
Yeah.
And I mean, he basically just, one man army. Well, not one man. He had some people behind him, but by and large, he didn't have anybody, like the mob behind him. But I mean, he was just taking them on. I mean, right there on the news, they blew up his house, blew up his car. I mean, they tried to kill him multiple times before they finally got him.
Yeah, they did. He was, I never quite figured out why he was such a threat to him. I know why the Spiros were a threat here, because it was a blood feud here. And, you set out to kill one brother, you better kill them all. This is a blood feud here to start with killing the oldest brother there in Cleveland. I never quite figured out why Danny Green, if he just wanted a little more action is what he wanted.
Yeah. In the movie, it's like, it kind of goes off the rails when they kill, I think it's, John Nardi, I think was his name.
Yeah.
That's when it kind of goes off the rails there. But I've always wondered that same thing. It's funny you asked that, of why he was such a threat. I mean, it seemed like to me they could have made him, a close partner and probably done good business with him, because he had a mind for business as well.
Yeah, he did. I didn't understand that, but you know, you never know about people.
Yeah. Well, that's actually some things I wanted to pick your brain on, because when I talk to guys with certain families and, you know, came up around certain guys, of course they kind of look to their mentors as being, you know, some of the best that they've been around, and who they, you know, kind of put them at the top spot. You know, you've interviewed a lot of people, you've done a lot of research on this. Who is some of the, like, the more top savvy, you know, mob guys in your day? I mean, to me, just off the top of my head, I would say Tony Accardo has got to be at the top of that list, because he never done a day in jail, and for, you know, a good little while controlled a lot of stuff
Yeah.
in Chicago. Another one being Carlo Gambino. Who's some of the, you know, the big heavyweights in your opinion that, you know, all this being a legal business, but done it, you know, as best they can, I guess you could say.
Well, you know, Carlos Marcello,
Yep.
he had a lot going on down there in New Orleans. You know, I did on my YouTube channel, I have a mob tour of New Orleans, and I met this guy, Ron Rawson, who, if you ever want to get somebody to talk about the New Orleans family, why, he's an expert on that. And Ron and I went around and I did a lot of research on Carlos Marcello. And, you know, he started out trying to rob a bank, or actually paid another guy. He got the gun for him and he tried to rob this bank. We went to this old bank, and it's over at what they call Algiers on the what they call the West Bank of the Mississippi. It's just outside of New Orleans, and he went from that. I think he actually did rob a corner store down in there as a young man. Did a little time, but he goes from that to later on in life, when he starts making some real money and getting things lined out. He bought, like, I want to say 6,000 acres down in there. That was basically, you know, at that time, it was basically bayou, you know, delta land that wasn't really good for anything. And of course, you know, that became, you know, years later, that was just, you know, hugely valuable piece of land just outside of what was New Orleans at the time. And so he was a good businessman. He didn't it didn't seem like he went around killing unnecessarily. I don't really see any in more modern times. There was no mob wars in New Orleans that I can think of.
No.
Smart enough to stay away from that, because that's what gets you. That, you know, starting those mob wars is what'll get you every time. You know, in Chicago, they never really had any mob wars. That's why Accardo and that Paul Rica and some of those guys just could sit back and they'd let, you know, they had Sam Giancana run everything while they sat back at Norwood's Mayo's restaurant and kind of approved everything. If it was big time, and then got Joey Aiupa to go do it. Mm-hmm. Aiupa was pretty good. You know, of course, Accardo was really in senior status when Aiupa kind of took over. You know, he got famous for the nickname Joey Doves because he got caught those 500 doves that he killed right down here in southwestern Kansas. He was good. He was quiet, and he was all business. And you didn't see, in Chicago, there was no factions that ever rose up against the ruling, whoever it was, against the
ruling commission, I guess you could say.
Well, I don't know if you call it the commission, get mixed up with the real commission, but there was never any mob wars. So to keep those mob wars down, and the 70s seemed to be the time for the mob wars. I think my theory is, both here in Cincinnati or Cleveland, was these guys were like the baby boomers, the guys that came out of Vietnam, that were born, you know, right after the war. And you had these old guys that were born in 1915, 1920, were still running things, and they weren't sharing on down the road a little bit. And they never had anything like that in Chicago. And they had Chicago wired, and from Capone till present day. You know, started with Capone. He had it going on too, because he was smart enough to really make himself into a folk hero up there. And you know, nobody'd ever say a bad word about Capone.
Yeah.
And they got, and the whole time they owned the whole county and the city, law enforcement and the court system, and, you know, the guy that ran the streets and gave out the contracts to have the snow removed. And, you know, they just had that whole city wired. It was amazing.
Yeah. And by and large, pretty much from everything that I've kind of researched, had a major hand in getting, Kennedy into the White House, albeit I think on pretenses to back off. And we know that didn't quite work out like that.
Yeah.
But a funny story I wanted to bring up, because you talked about Carlos Marcello. Wasn't there something where he wasn't, I think, an American citizen or something, and they dropped him off like in Africa?
No, that's a good story, though. I got that straight story that Ron Rawson came up with the straight story. And it's documented in newspapers at the time. People, the rumor gets around and people repeat the rumor because it's much more fun than a real story. He was actually, I think he held was born in Guatemala, but it was one of those funny deals when people came over from Italy. A lot of times they came through Cuba. Somehow he had been down in Guatemala or something, and he had business down there too later on in life. So maybe he didn't have relatives down there, but anyhow, so he's up in the United States and he's not an American citizen. And so they did, when they actually did deport him and flew him down there and just let him off. His lawyer was down there with him, and he spent several days. They didn't drop him off in the middle of the jungle or anything.
Yeah, that's the story that I heard, that they dropped him out. He didn't have any shoes on. He had to get his back.
Yeah, makes a good start. And he beat the feds back.
Yeah. Done it all by foot and beat them back.
Yeah. He beat him back. Yeah, that's
now, he had a lot of power, though. I mean, like you said, to be out there in Louisiana, I think his word carried a lot of weight, and that was pretty impressive for him to be out there, and like you said, not ever really have any kind of uprising, any big mob wars. I mean, he pretty much ran it, and I think everyone was happy with him because he didn't really ever have anybody challenge him, at least not in those days. And obviously, they all kind of got together and were a little pissed at the Kennedys. I mean, I know this is kind of, you got like the Kennedy situation and Jimmy Hoffa. It's just those things I don't think we'll ever, get answers to, because whoever pulled it off is, probably, I would bet money probably now is dead, or at least, probably about to die here within the hour. But
there's a lot of connection with Marcello and Oswald.
And that's what I was going to say. That's a lot.
There is definitely a connection. Ron came up with Oswald's father had run numbers or something there in New Orleans, and then he was there in New Orleans. He had to, what he was doing when he was there in New Orleans, he had to have known people. New Orleans is not that big, so so there he could have been known. He could have had connections with him, his father, through his father and through him too. So it's possible that they could have.
An interesting guy that gets brought up from time to time, Woody Harrelson's father.
Oh yeah, Charles Harrelson, I think. So,
yeah, Charles is the first, I think, hit on a federal judge. I think.
Yeah, he got charged. That was it. John Wood was that judge's name?
I think so.
Maximum John, they called him. He would give these egregious sentences. And I've never really done that story on the podcast. I've just read a book, I think, years ago, and I think he was going to sentence a guy named Jimmy Chagra, who was a big time Lebanese mob guy out of El Paso in narcotics, and they were afraid that he was going to give him, the max, a huge big sentence, and he did end up in Leavenworth for quite a while. But yeah, his dad got contracted with, or sent and put the judge. I think he put a bomb on the judge's car, I believe, and killed him.
Yeah, and I think Woody doesn't talk about it much, but I did see him speak on an interview where he was saying that I guess that murder of the judge, that was like probably the weakest case that anybody had. And he said, I want to say in so many words that, look, I know my father's no saint, but what he got put in jail for, they didn't really have the evidence to put him in jail for. I'm guessing, meaning they probably could have done it for a bunch of other stuff, but at least for that one, the case.
Like we used to say, he done something.
Yeah.
He may not have did that, but he did something. I know that thought process.
Getting back to New York for just a second, John Gotti is like probably one of the most debated people, because you have people that love him for, his bravado and, his, I guess you would say, just didn't give a damn, flaunted authority, taking out Paul Castellano. But at the same time, if you look at it from a business standpoint, that was everything that the mob avoided for years, while they were able to do what they wanted to do or the way they did it for so many years. What is your take on, John? Because even though when they got him, he was obviously the target for the feds, but John could have talked and at least maybe probably made it easier on himself at that point. But I don't think he would have, if he lived, like he said in that movie, I think lived to be 5,000. If he lived to be that long, I don't think he'd ever said a word.
Yeah, doesn't seem like it. And of course, if you think about it, who was he going to tell on? You got to tell on somebody more important than you are. Yeah, who's he going to tell on?
I would think if he probably had some information on some of the other bosses, maybe like Chin Gigante or, Gas Pipe Castle. I know they were having a little bit of wars there too.
Yeah, he might have, but it's still, he's got to have direct knowledge to really help. Otherwise, he can be an informant.
Right.
One of these guys that just like kind of tells you, oh, this is going on. He did that. He did this. He did that. Just kind of tip you to things that then you can go focus on the guy and try to build some kind of a case. But he'd have to have direct knowledge to be any good and go into witness protection. Now, Sammy the Bull, he had direct knowledge. He had carried these things out at the request of John Gotti. So he can take down the guy above him who ordered him. So Gotti, and then Gotti probably wouldn't have talked, even if he had somebody that he could barter away.
I don't think he would have. I mean, Sammy, I do think he was, a really crippling witness. We had a guy on our show a couple weeks ago. His episode hadn't come out yet, but Anthony Arlotta.
Oh yeah, I've seen
from
that
Boston.
name.
There was reports wrote that he was like one of the best witnesses that the government had ever had.
Oh really?
And he was a weird case because he was a Genovese guy, and he was made into the Genovese, but he ran out of Boston, out of Springfield, Mass. So that was an interesting story. When I first got into this, I didn't realize that some of these families from New York had factions running out of, their states. I interviewed Bobby Luisi, who I think you've interviewed as well.
Yeah.
He, got made out of Philadelphia, and then, came back to Springfield. I didn't realize they branched out quite like that.
Yeah, Genovese family particularly had a lot of people and a lot of influence out into Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm. I met Vincent the Chin Gigante's daughter, Rita.
Mm-hmm.
I had a chance to meet her at a thing I was at in New York last month, and she's real small compared to her dad, but she told some stories about her dad and some, different things that happened. And she said that, he would have to go and check himself into the hospital to kind of keep up this charade that he was trying to pull. But she told this story. She said there was this guy, I want to say, she said it was they had a dog and it got after, I don't know, it was her or somebody on the block. Anyway, she said that it was like a big to-do because he wasn't trying to do anything with the dog. And then she said, next thing you know, the guy and the dog disappeared. So she said, God only knows what happened to him.
Yeah.
But that was, I had this picture of the Chin in my mind, big, tall individual. And she was like real small, like real petite lady. And I was just like, man, but I hope to be able to get her on the show. Cause, the Chin might be one of the most powerful, mob bosses ever. A lot of people are watching that show right now, Godfather of Harlem. You ever seen that?
Yeah. I was just going to ask you it now. Did she talk about that?
We were going to. She didn't get into that on that particular time, but if I get her on the show, that's what I want to talk about because, it's a well-acted show, but the timeline on there is very screwed up. And somehow I don't think that she was dating a black guy who was a great musician. No, I don't think she was either.
I don't care how big a rebel she was. I don't think she was doing that back then.
No, and they have that where it's like Paul Castellano and Vincent Gigante are like almost friends at the time. I was like, does people not know that he tried to kill him? Like he was, about an inch away from putting one on his head. It went through his fedora. And that was, by and large, what made, Costello just kind of take a back seat. But the timelines on there were just really added up. And a lot of them, I think, don't even add up when Bumpy Johnson was even out of prison.
Yeah, I didn't really, I just watched it for
entertainment sake.
Entertainment sake. I didn't really think about it too much. It was just kind of entertaining.
That's about the only thing you can do with a lot of stuff, because another thing too, what I've realized in interviewing a lot of these people, and I'm sure you probably come across this too, is Hollywood definitely takes their liberties.
Oh yeah.
In changing things and making things. And I understand that sometimes it might be the betterment for the movie. Sometimes it might be you maybe can't go as violent as what happened. But I would say Casino went. I mean, I know that they didn't get beat in a cornfield; they actually got beat in a basement. But that whole setup where Spilatro and his brother, or Joe Pesci and his brother, got beat in that cornfield, that might have been one of the most graphic beatings and killings I've seen in any mob movie at all. Even, I mean, you're talking Sopranos, Goodfellas. I mean, that was pretty rough, pretty graphic.
Yeah, it was.
And I think
and they got a lot of things right. They really worked in Casino, like the whole scene at the Gaming Commission hearing with Oscar Goodman, and Lefty Rosenthal or Ace Rothstein and Robert De Niro character. That whole thing, there's like a video out there called it's on YouTube. It's about that time. It's all news clips, and so Harry Reid was the chairman of the Gaming Commission. He ran that meeting in which they brought Lefty Rosenthal in. They were suspending his license is what they were doing, and he was fighting that suspension. And everything in the casino was really basically the same as what you saw in that documentary that has the real deal footage from that day. And that thing happened, even down to how he was dressed, how everybody was dressed. So they did a lot of things right, but they took a lot of liberties too. We were always mad at it here in Kansas City because they just kind of made Kansas City look like a bunch of goofs, and they didn't really show how important Nick Savella was.
Yeah, and I think too, probably, and I've heard quite a few people mention this, is The Irishman is probably the one that they took the most liberties with.
Oh yeah,
I'm sure you've seen that. What's your take on The Irishman, real quick, and we'll kind of wrap up with that.
Well, I did a story of Joey Gallo, and Cam Robinson, my friend from Chicago, and I did it together. He found this old book written by a guy named Nick the Greek, Nick Galatos, I think. He was a good friend and a bodyguard to Joey Gallo for a long time, since he was a young man. They knew each other. And he was with Gallo that night. And so that guy describes what went on that night, this Nick the Greek. So they were it was Joey Gallo's birthday. His wife was there, and they were at the Copacabana. Don Rickles was doing his act. He did make some mention about the Italians, and Joey Gallo kind of acted like he was going to throw a bottle at him or something, and kind of a little joshing back and forth. And Bufalino was there. And Nick the Greek said, yeah, Gallo did go talk to him, and Gallo did, and he did start bad mouthing Joe Colombo to Bufalino, who was bad mouthing the Colombo about the Italian American civil rights.
Yeah, deal. all the headlines.
All that happened, and then he left and went over to the. And Jerry Orbach was there too.
That's what I've heard, that Jerry Orbach was there, and then people have said he wasn't.
He was at the Copa.
Right.
But they asked him to go because he knew Orbach. Gallo by this time had gotten to know a lot of celebrities in Manhattan. Right. Asked him to go to dinner with them, and it was about 4:00 in the morning when they finally got there. And he said no, he couldn't do it, or didn't want to, whatever. They did leave there, and they were going to go eat Chinese food. So then the Chinese place was closed. So then they just were kind of driving toward Little Italy there on Mulberry Street, and they saw the Umbertos, and they see Matty the horse Aiello standing out front. Said, "Hey, is this food any good?" He said, "Yeah, it's great." He said, "My brother owns it." So they parked and went in. Well, Nick the Greek, he's the first person. He was there, and we know he was there because he was arrested. He was shot that night. He had his own gun, and he's shot, and he shoots back at these guys, and he's wounded, and he takes a case for being a felon in possession of a gun for that night. So we know he was there. And he told all the rest of this, but there's nothing. He told nothing about the big Irishman, the 6'2", light complected Irishman anywhere with the Bufalino incident. And also, when the guys came in and started shooting at Gallo, both he and Gallo's wife described him as short Italian guys. And Nick even says it was a certain guy that was doing it. Now, he never testified against him, but he said it was a certain guy that did it. And the Bureau came up with somebody else that verified all this, and who put that hit team together. They just couldn't make a case. So just that one scene alone was enough for me. You know, if you're gonna try to put him in that scene, and then they tried to put him up in Chicago, tried to put him at the guy that set the bomb on Alan Dorfman. Well, Chicago's got plenty of. They never shopped out any kind of hits. Or any kind of action like that. Now if they did, I never heard of it.
Well, I mean, in Detroit, the same way. I don't really feel like Detroit would need to shop out people that, if by and large they wanted to be the ones that take out Hoffa. I mean,
right.
You know, the Tocos there had the power to be able to do something like that. And it was a funny stat. You know, I've studied a lot of this stuff, and I think it was Scott Bernstein that mentioned it on his original Gangsters podcast. Mm-hmm. But it's either been like a very long number of years. I'm sure it had to be at some point, but it's a long time since anyone in the Detroit mob had ever been brought up on murder charges.
Yeah.
So, and you know, there's been some murders happening over there in Detroit. So for the fact that that has went down and nobody has ever been brought up on murder charges, that lets you know a thing or two about Detroit knows how to handle their business.
Yeah. It's kind of like Kansas City. Nobody from Detroit ever came in.
Right.
Nobody from Kansas City was ever charged with murder. Nobody ever was turned. Nobody ever came in. Nobody of any note ever talked at all. So, you know, it's, you know, they took care of business themselves. It was their job. Hoffa was their guy. It would have been their business to take care of. I think everybody agreed that they need to get him out of there because he was about ready to upset the apple cart on the pension fund. Kansas City would have been all over that. You know, you got to get that guy out of there. We want our boy Roy Lee Williams to be the president of the international president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, not Jimmy Hoffa again.
Do you think the depictation of what happened to him is accurate, regardless of who done it? We'll take that out of the equation, but you know, the burning.
I don't know. It's, you know, it's all speculation after he disappeared, because nobody's ever mentioned a word of any kind that I know of. Nobody legitimate.
You know, I've got a guy, and I'll wrap up here. He contacted me. I don't even know how he found me. He called me, and he swears up and down. I think his name's Michael Yarborough. He swears up and down that he was in the Renaissance Center. He was going to apply for a job, and he needed to go. I don't want to say he was trying to find a restroom or something, and he went into an area that was like construction or something along those lines. And he swears up and down that he's seen guys throw Hoffa into like the big pylon there in the Renaissance Center. And he was like, he said, I will take a lie detector test. I'll do whatever I need to do. He said, if they think I'm lying, they've got to have some kind of equipment that they can go in there and check with. And I'm just like, well, I mean, yeah, he's kind of right, but he's been saying this for a long time.
Yeah.
And I mean, you know, it's one of those things where it's like, I mean, he could be telling the truth, but then again, there might be 4 or 5 bodies laying in that Renaissance Center, and none of them could be Hoffa. You know, you don't know. He might have seen him. That don't necessarily mean it was Hoffa.
I think the speculations is half the fun on this.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, that just goes to show whoever did do this, they done it right.
Yeah.
You know, by and large, it's been rumored that he's from, you know, Meadowlands, Giant Stadium, 50-yard line to, you know, all the way back over in New Jersey, which I think is pretty asinine. I don't know why you would kill somebody and then transport them, you know, a couple states over. But, you know, whoever done it right. Well, Gary, man, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show. I could talk to you for hours, man. I know we were kind of all over the board here, but I just wanted to pick your brain on some things, and maybe next time if we can get together, we can pick a soul case to work on, because one of the episodes that you did that I'll tell some of our listeners about, that one where you kind of talked about mob controlling some of the motion pictures, like Texas Chainsaw Massacre and stuff. That was a fantastic episode. It gets me through my work day. So all of our listeners, go check him out, Gangland Wire. We'll put a link to it in our show notes for this episode, so you can go over there and check some of his stuff out, because he's got a lot of fantastic content on there.
All right, Wade, thanks a lot. It's a pleasure being here.
Thank you, sir. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I am Hollywood Wade. That was Gary Jenkins, and unfortunately, we are out of time. Tune in next week for an all-new episode of Crime and Entertainment. Gary, we appreciate it, my friend.
All right. See ya.